Quick question. How many people lived in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492? If you're like most people, you probably learned that there were a few million at most. Sparse populations scattered across two vast continents. Small tribes living a simple life in harmony with nature. Essentially empty lands just waiting to be discovered and settled by Europeans. What if I told you that number was wrong by tens of millions? What if the history you learned in school wasn't just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong about almost everything? The cities, the populations, the technology, the political systems, and even how long humans had been present, all of it was radically different from what we were taught. Today, there are over 500 federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States alone, thousands more throughout Central and South America. Millions of people keeping alive traditions, languages, and knowledge systems that stretch back further than most of us can imagine. They are here. They have always been here. But the story of how they got here, and what they built along the way, looks nothing like the version in your history textbooks. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. So feel free to subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love reading the comments and seeing that it's sunrise in Sydney and midnight in Chicago, afternoon in London. All of us together sharing this experience. You see, here is what happened. For generations, textbooks taught a very convenient narrative. Native Americans arrived about 13,000 years ago by crossing a land bridge from Asia. They lived in small, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. They had no writing, no cities, no complex civilization. When Europeans arrived, they brought civilization to a wild, empty land. End of story. Except none of that is true. Well, all right, a fraction of it is partially true, but it has been simplified and watered down to the point of fiction. It's like describing modern America by saying people live in houses and eat food. It is technically accurate, but it misses absolutely everything that matters. The real story is so much stranger and more fascinating than the myth. It involves cities larger than London or Paris at their peak. Agricultural systems so sophisticated that modern scientists are still trying to figure out how they worked. Political confederations that influenced the founding fathers when they drafted the Constitution. Medical knowledge that saved European lives at the exact moment Europeans were destroying indigenous societies. And timelines that don't stretch back 13,000 years, but perhaps 20,000, 30,000, or even more. You know that feeling when you suddenly realize you've been looking at something backward? That moment the image flips and everything makes a completely different kind of sense. That is what is happening right now in archaeology, anthropology, and Native American studies. Every few years, a new discovery pushes the dates back even further, reveals another massive settlement, brings to light another sophisticated technology that wasn't supposed to exist. The classic version of Native American history was written primarily by people who had never met an indigenous person, never visited their lands, never tried to understand their culture on their own terms. Or worse, it was written by people who had a vested interest in portraying indigenous peoples as primitive and uncivilized. Because if they were primitive, then colonization wasn't a genocide, it was progress. Manifest destiny bringing light into the darkness. But here's the thing about the truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. Especially not when there are millions of descendants who never forgot their real history, who kept the stories alive through oral traditions, ceremonies, and their stubborn refusal to let their culture die. And especially not when modern archaeology keeps unearthing evidence that contradicts the convenient myths. What you are about to hear isn't just a correction of historical facts, though there are plenty of those. It is a complete reframing of our understanding of human history in the Americas. From the first arrivals, tens of thousands of years ago, through the rise and fall of civilizations that rivaled those of Europe or Asia, to the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history, and the ongoing resilience of cultures that refuse to be erased. This is the history you were never taught. The one that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about civilization progress and what it means to be indigenous to a place. The one that has been hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to finally open our eyes and see it. So let's start at the very beginning. Or rather, let's start at what we thought was the beginning and watch it collapse under the weight of new evidence. For most of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans seemed settled. The Clovis people arrived about 13,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. They moved south through an ice-free corridor spread rapidly across the continent, and became the ancestors of all Native American peoples. Simple, elegant, and completely wrong. The Clovis first theory dominated American archaeology for decades. It was taught in every textbook, featured in every documentary, accepted as established fact. Then in the 1970s, a graduate student named Tom Dillehay began excavating a site in southern Chile called Monteverde. What he found shouldn't have existed. Stone tools, wooden structures, preserved plant remains, all dating back at least 14,500 years, a full 1,000 years before Clovis. More importantly, it was in Chile, thousands of miles south of where the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived first. Do the math. If people were living in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, they had to have crossed North America much earlier. Then they had to travel the entire length of 2 continents, adapt to dozens of different environments, and establish viable populations. That takes time, a lot of time. The archaeological establishment fought Monteverde for decades. They questioned the dating methods, disputed the interpretation of the artifacts, suggested contamination. But Dillehay was meticulous. He had organic materials sealed in peat bogs, stratigraphic layers that couldn't be mixed. Multiple independent dating techniques all converging on the same time frame. By the late 1990s, even the skeptics had to concede. Monteverde was real. The Clovis first theory was dead. But if Monteverde killed the Clovis theory, what came next rewrote the entire story. In 2021, researchers published findings from White Sands National Park in New Mexico. There they found footprints, human footprints, from adults and children walking along the muddy shores of an ancient lake. The prints were preserved in layers of sediment between deposits of aquatic plant seeds, which could be accurately dated using radiocarbon methods. The dates were shocking, between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. Let that sink in. People were walking in New Mexico at the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered most of Canada and the northern United States. The ice-free corridor they were supposed to use to migrate south didn't exist yet. It was buried under a mile of ice. So, how did they get there? The answer likely lies in boats. For years, archaeologists had dismissed the idea of a coastal migration. The first Americans were big game hunters, the theory went. They followed mammoth herds across the Bering Land Bridge. They had no maritime technology. They couldn't have traveled down the Pacific coast. Except we now know that is absurd. Humans have been using boats for at least 50,000 years, probably much longer. Indigenous Australians reached their continent by sea at least 65,000 years ago. If they could cross the ocean, why couldn't the people living along the North Pacific coast travel south by boat? The coastal migration hypothesis actually makes more sense than the land bridge model in several ways. Coastlines provide reliable resources. Fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds. You can travel long distances relatively quickly by water. And most importantly, the Pacific coast was free of ice during periods when the interior was blocked by glaciation. A sea route would have been open when the land route was impossible. The problem is that we struggle to find the archaeological sites to prove it. Sea levels at the end of the Ice Age were 300 feet lower than they are today. The coastlines where people would have lived and traveled are now underwater. The camps, villages, or processing sites of that era are buried beneath dozens of feet of ocean. We are essentially trying to reconstruct human history with 90% of the evidence permanently submerged. But we are finding clues. On the Channel Islands of California, there are sites dating back over 13,000 years. These islands were never connected to the mainland, even during the Ice Age. The only way to reach them was by boat. The sites show evidence of sophisticated maritime adaptation, specialized tools for processing marine resources, the remains of deep water fish that could only be caught from boats. These weren't casual visitors to the coast. These were peoples whose entire culture was oriented toward the ocean. Similar evidence continues to surface at sites along the Pacific coast of North and South America. In Oregon at the Paisley Caves, researchers found human coprolites, preserved feces, dating back over 14,000 years. DNA analysis showed that these people were eating freshwater fish and wetland plants, suggesting they were already well established in interior environments by that date. In Chile, at Huaca Prieta, archaeologists found fishing nets and hooks dating back 14,500 years. Again, evidence of sophisticated maritime technology long before the Clovis model could explain it. But the real revolution came from genetics. When researchers began analyzing the DNA of modern Native American populations and comparing it to ancient remains, they found something unexpected. The genetic diversity was far greater than a single migration could have produced. There were distinct lineages, separate founding populations, evidence of multiple waves of migration unfolding over thousands of years. Current genetic evidence suggests at least 3 major migratory events, possibly more. The first wave, arriving perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 years ago, gave rise to most Native American populations in North and South America. But there were also later arrivals. The Nadene peoples of northwestern North America showed genetic evidence of a separate migration about 12,000 years ago. The Inuit and Aleut peoples represent yet another wave, arriving only about 5,000 years ago. Even within that first great migration, there is evidence of complexity. Certain genetic lineages seem to have diverged from one another long before arriving in the Americas. This suggests they might have been separated for thousands of years in Beringia, the land bridge region between Asia and North America, during the last glacial maximum. Beringia was actually a vast subcontinent over 1,000 miles wide, with its own distinct ecosystems. Populations could have lived there for millennia, adapting to local conditions, developing distinct cultural and genetic profiles before moving south into the Americas. There is even evidence hinting at possible arrivals prior to the last glacial maximum. Certain stone tools from sites in Mexico and Brazil have been dated to 30,000 years ago or more. While these dates remain controversial, if accurate, they would require multiple migrations spanning tens of thousands of years, with earlier populations potentially being replaced or absorbed by later arrivals. The DNA evidence also reveals unexpected connections. Some ancient American populations carry genetic markers more commonly associated with populations in Southeast Asia, Oceania, and even Australia. This has led some researchers to propose a coastal migration route around the Pacific Rim, with people island hopping from Asia to the Americas. It sounds far-fetched, until you remember that humans reached Australia by sea 65,000 years ago. The technology existed. The question is whether anyone used it to reach the Americas. One of the most intriguing cases is the skeleton of Luzia in Brazil, dated to around 11,500 years ago. Facial reconstruction suggested features closer to indigenous Australians or Africans than to modern Native Americans. This sparked speculation about early migrations coming from different source populations. The skeleton was tragically destroyed in a museum fire in 2018. But the questions it raised remain unanswered. What we are seeing is a picture of the peopling of the Americas that is infinitely more complex than anyone imagined 50 years ago. Not a single migration of big game hunters following mammoths through an ice corridor, but multiple waves of migrants using various routes and technologies over tens of thousands of years. Maritime peoples traveling by boat down the Pacific coast. Inland groups moving through temporary openings in the ice sheets, and possibly even trans-Pacific voyages arriving from unexpected directions. Each wave brought different knowledge, different adaptations, different genetic and cultural contributions. These populations met, mingled, competed, and cooperated. They adapted to every environment across 2 continents, from the Arctic tundra to the Amazon rainforest, from coastal deserts to high mountain plateaus, and they did so over a timeline far longer than we have ever acknowledged. The implications are profound. When we push the arrival date back from 13,000 years to 22,000 or 25,000 years, we aren't just adding a few millennia. We are fundamentally altering our understanding of the depth of indigenous presence in the Americas. We are recognizing that Native American peoples have occupied this land for as long as modern humans have lived anywhere outside of Africa. The Americas are not a newly settled frontier in human history. They are a homeland as ancient as any other on Earth, and we are only just beginning to grasp the true story. New sites are being discovered all the time. New dating methods push the boundaries even further. Underwater archaeology is finally starting to explore those submerged coastlines where so much evidence lies hidden. Genetic analysis is becoming more sophisticated, revealing subtle population movements and mixing events that were invisible just a few years ago. Every new discovery adds complexity to the story. But that complexity is the whole point. The true story of the first Americans isn't simple because human history is never simple. People don't migrate in neat waves following predictable patterns. They explore, adapt, innovate, sometimes succeed and sometimes fail. They travel by every available route, using every technology they can devise, and over thousands of years, they transform themselves and their environments in ways that leave traces we are only now learning to read. The people who reached the Americas first were among the greatest explorers in human history. They crossed continents, navigated coastlines, forged paths through some of the harshest environments on Earth. And they did it so long ago that their journeys have been almost completely erased from the physical landscape. We are piecing together their story from footprints preserved in ancient mud tools, found in underwater caves, and genetic markers carried in the DNA of their descendants. It is one of the greatest detective stories in archaeology, and we are only on the first chapter. But here is what we know for sure. By 15,000 years ago, and perhaps much earlier, populations had spread throughout North and South America. They had settled into diverse environments, developing distinct cultures and technologies. And they were about to do something unprecedented in human history. They were about to build civilizations. Let's get this straight right now. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they didn't find an empty wilderness dotted with primitive nomads living in teepees. They found cities. Real cities. Cities with populations that would have made medieval Paris look like a village. Cities with urban planning that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Cities that had already risen, thrived, and been abandoned long before Columbus ever got lost trying to find India. The largest was Cahokia, and almost no one has ever heard of it. Picture this. It's the year 1250 AD, not in antiquity but in the Middle Ages. England has just started building Westminster Abbey. Paris is the largest city in Europe, with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, and right in the middle of what is now Illinois, just across the river from the modern city of St. Louis. There is a city that rivals them both, Cahokia. At its peak, between 10,000 and 40,000 people lived there. The uncertainty of that number tells you everything about how radically this place was erased from popular consciousness. We know medieval Paris down to the street level. For Cahokia, we are still arguing over whether it had 10,000 or 40,000 residents. But even the low estimate makes it larger than London at the same time. You walk into the city on a warm summer morning. The first thing you see, the thing that dominates the landscape for miles around, is Monk's Mound. It rises 100 feet into the air, a massive earthen pyramid with a footprint of over 14 acres, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It wasn't built with stone blocks and slave labor, but raised basket by basket, generation after generation. Millions of cubic feet of earth carried by hand and carefully shaped into a monument that would last 1,000 years. At the top sits the palace of whoever rules this place, chief king, high priest. We still don't know the exact social structure, but from up there you can see the entire city spread out below. Hundreds of earthen mounds, some for temples, some for the residences of the elite, some for purposes we can only guess at. Each mound is positioned with mathematical precision. Between the mounds are thousands of houses, not simple huts, but sophisticated wooden structures with plastered walls, sometimes 2 stories high. Certain areas show evidence of attached buildings forming courtyard complexes, apartment-style living that wouldn't be reinvented in America for another 600 years. The streets are laid out in a grid. In 1250, most European cities were organic tangles of winding alleys that had evolved randomly over centuries. Cahokia was planned. Someone sat down and designed this place, mapping out neighborhoods, plazas, residential zones. Archaeological surveys have revealed that the grid stretched for miles, showing a level of urban planning that suggests a centralized authority and sophisticated administrative systems. And then there is Woodhenge. Actually, there are several Woodhenge's circles of massive wooden posts erected on the western edge of the city, aligned to mark the equinoxes and solstices. Stand in the center during the spring equinox and watch the sun rise directly over a specific post. The people of Cahokia tracked celestial movements with the precision of any European observatory of the time. They predicted eclipses, planned agricultural calendars, creating a sacred landscape where the earth and the sky synchronized. Take a walk down to the Grand Plaza. It was artificially leveled and filled to create 50 acres of flat land, the gathering place for ceremonies and possibly sporting events. Chunky was their game, rolling stone discs and throwing spears to land as close as possible. Archaeological evidence suggests they took it seriously, very seriously. Some burials show individuals apparently sacrificed after chunky tournaments, suggesting the stakes went far beyond mere bragging rights. You could hear the city from miles away, the sounds of thousands of people going about their daily lives. Artisans at work, children playing, merchants haggling, the smell of cooking fires, the distinctive scent of corn being processed. Cahokia was the center of a trade network that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf, mica from the Appalachians. You find exotic materials in Cahokia from sources over 1,000 miles away. This wasn't a village, it was a cosmopolitan metropolis, a cultural and economic hub that dominated the Mississippian world, and then it vanished. Around the year 1350 it was abandoned, not destroyed by conquest, not burned by invaders, just empty. The people left. We still argue about why. Climate change seems to have played a role. The region experienced a series of droughts and floods that may have strained agricultural systems. Overpopulation probably didn't help. When you pack tens of thousands of people into a pre-industrial city, sanitation becomes a challenge. Disease outbreaks were likely common. But there is another theory. Maybe they left because they wanted to. Maybe centralized, hierarchical societies aren't universally appealing. Maybe, after a few centuries under the thumb of chiefs or priests, the people decided they preferred smaller, more egalitarian communities. The archaeological record shows the population dispersed, but didn't disappear. They just moved to smaller settlements, scattered across the region. Cahokia wasn't unique. Head southwest and you will find something equally remarkable. The ancestral Puebloans, often called the Anasazi, though many modern Pueblo peoples object to that term, were building cities in the desert, while Europe was stumbling through the Dark Ages. Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Between 900 and 1150 AD, this remote canyon became the center of a civilization that spanned over 100,000 square miles. They built great houses, massive stone structures up to 5 stories tall, with hundreds of rooms. Pueblo Bonito, the largest, contained over 600 rooms and 40 ceremonial chambers called kivas. These weren't random constructions. The buildings are aligned to solar and lunar cycles with astronomical precision. The walls are built with stone masonry that would impress any European stonemason of the Middle Ages. Some walls are 3 feet thick, constructed with careful layering that still stands 1,000 years later. And they built roads. Perfectly straight roads up to 30 feet wide, stretching for hundreds of miles across desert terrain. Roads that go straight up and over mesas and cliffs, rather than following easier paths. Why build such roads? We don't know. There is no evidence of wheeled vehicles. Perhaps they were sacred ceremonial pathways connecting outlying communities to the canyon. Perhaps they served economic purposes we haven't yet understood. But here is where it gets truly interesting. Great houses require massive amounts of timber. Putting a roof on a structure the size of Pueblo Bonito demands enormous wooden beams. The problem, Chaco Canyon is practically treeless, so they went to forests 50 miles away to get the wood. They cut down huge ponderosa pines and firs, some weighing over 600 pounds, and hauled them across the desert to the canyon. Dendrochronology shows they did this for generations. This required organization, planning a workforce capable of coordinated effort, supply chains capable of moving heavy materials over long distances. That is a complexity worthy of a civilization. Then further north at Mesa Verde in Colorado. Between 1150 and 1300, the ancestral Puebloans built something that still seems impossible today. Cliff dwellings. Entire villages built into alcoves inside sheer sandstone cliffs, dozens of feet above the valley floor. Cliff Palace contains 150 rooms and 23 kivas. It was built under a cliff overhang, protected from rain and snow, positioned to catch the winter sun for warmth and the summer shade for cooling. The engineering is brilliant. They hoisted stones, logs, and water up those cliffs, using hand and footholds carved into the rock face. They created multi-story structures that cling to the cliffs without mortar, just precisely cut interlocking stones. Living there must have been extraordinary. Waking up in your stone room carved into the cliff. Climbing down ladders to reach the kivas for ceremonies. looking out over the valley from your alcove dozens of feet in the air. The sense of security must have been immense. No one attacks a cliff dwelling without considerable effort. But here again, abandonment. Around 1300, Mesa Verde was empty. Climate change, probably. The region experienced a catastrophic drought in the late 1200s. When your agriculture depends on careful water management and the rain stops falling, cities become untenable. But the people didn't disappear. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who have maintained cultural continuity for 7 centuries. These were not nomads. These were not primitive hunter-gatherers scratching the earth for mere survival. These were urban civilizations with sophisticated architecture, astronomical knowledge, vast trade networks and social structures complex enough to organize the labor needed to build monuments that would last a millennium. And there were others. The Hohokam in southern Arizona built over 500 miles of irrigation canals, creating an agricultural system that supported cities of thousands. The canals were so well designed that the modern city of Phoenix still uses some of the exact same alignments. The Poverty Point culture in Louisiana from 1700 to 1100 BC built massive earthwork complexes, including one of the largest mounds in North America, predating Cahokia by 2,000 years. When Europeans arrived, most of these cities were already ancient ruins. The populations had dispersed, transformed, reorganized into different social structures. So Europeans saw abandoned cities, assumed they had always been abandoned, and invented myths about lost civilizations and mysterious ancient peoples who vanished without a trace. The truth is simpler and more interesting. Cities rise and fall, civilizations transform. People make choices about how they want to live. Sometimes they build vast urban centers. Sometimes they decide those centers aren't working and return to smaller communities. Neither choice makes them more or less civilized. But the myth persisted. Native Americans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They didn't build cities, had no civilization, and lived in a primitive state before Europeans arrived to civilize them. This myth dies hard, but it has to go. Because understanding what was really here, the sophistication and complexity of indigenous American civilizations, changes everything about how we understand the history of this continent. This was not an empty land waiting to be settled. It was a land with its own urban traditions, its own architectural genius, and its own social experiments that rose and fell on their own terms. Long before a European ship ever appeared on the horizon, the stones were still there. The mounds still rise from the earth. The cliff dwellings still cling to their rock faces, physical evidence that demands we revise our assumptions and recognize indigenous Americans as the civilization builders they always were. Here is what most people picture when they hear the words Amazon rainforest. An immaculate wilderness, pristine nature, the lungs of the earth, existing exactly as they have for millions of years. A place where humans were only mere visitors, living lightly on the land without leaving a trace. All of that is wrong. The Amazon is a wilderness, it is a garden. A garden on the scale of an entire continent, carefully designed, planted and tended by indigenous engineers for thousands of years. And we only discovered it by accident. In the 1960s, archaeologists began noticing something strange in the Amazon. In certain areas, the soil was completely different from the surrounding tropical forest. Instead of the typically nutrient-poor dirt that characterizes most rainforests, they found patches of dark, incredibly rich earth. Locals called it terra preta, dark earth, and they had known about it for generations. Wherever you found terra preta, crops grew better, much better. Scientists were puzzled. How did this soil get there? Natural processes don't create that kind of nutrient concentration. In tropical environments, the rain washes everything away too quickly. So they started testing the soil composition, and what they found changed everything we thought we knew about the Amazon. Terra preta is not natural, it is manufactured. A sophisticated agricultural technology developed by indigenous peoples starting around 2,500 years ago. Perhaps earlier. They created it by combining charcoal, bone manure, and organic waste in specific proportions, then working the soil over generations. The result was a super soil that could remain fertile for centuries, even millennia. Some terra preta deposits are still more productive than the surrounding soils today, 500 years after the collapse of the cultures that created them. But here is where it gets crazy. These patches of engineered soil aren't rare. They are everywhere. Researchers have identified terra preta sites covering potentially 10% of the Amazon basin. That is an area the size of France entirely shaped by human hands, entirely an evidence of sophisticated environmental engineering on a scale that would make modern agronomists jealous. And the implications go deeper. When researchers started analyzing which plant species grow in terra preta zones compared to the natural forest, they found something remarkable. The trees growing in these transformed soils are primarily useful species. Brazil nuts, cacao fruit trees, palm species that provide food, fiber, and building materials. The Amazon rainforest is not a wilderness where humans occasionally gathered wild foods. It is an orchard, a food forest planted and managed by indigenous peoples who understood ecological engineering in a way we are only just beginning to grasp. Some researchers estimate that up to 12% of the tree species in the Amazon are there because ancient peoples planted, cultivated, and dispersed them across the basin. Think about that for a moment. The ultimate symbol of pristine nature, the place we point to when we talk about true wilderness, turns out to be one of the largest human-managed landscapes on Earth. But the Amazon wasn't unique. Turn your attention north to what is now the United States, and you find engineering projects that rival anything the ancient world produced. Southern Ohio, near the town of Peebles. There, winding along the top of a cliff overlooking a creek is something that shouldn't exist, according to the old narratives. The Great Serpent Mound, a massive undulating earthen rampart in the shape of a snake, stretching for 1,348 feet from head to tail. Its body curves into 7 distinct coils before ending in a tightly wound spiral tail. The head is aligned with the summer solstice sunset. It was built at least 2,000 years ago, perhaps more. No one knows for sure because earthworks don't leave the kind of evidence that is easy to date. But what we do know is staggering. Moving that much earth required organization planning. A society capable of mobilizing hundreds, perhaps thousands of workers for a project that served no obvious practical purpose. It wasn't a dwelling, it wasn't a fort, it was something else entirely. Art, architecture, and astronomy combined into a single statement carved into the landscape itself. And it isn't alone. The Ohio River Valley contains thousands of earthwork sites. Massive geometric enclosures covering dozens of acres, perfectly circular mounds laid out in precise astronomical alignments. Complex shapes that required sophisticated surveying and mathematical skills to construct. The Hopewell culture, which built many of these structures between 100 BC and 500 AD, wasn't made up of primitive villagers barely surviving in the wilderness. They were engineers leading landscape-scale projects that required abstract reasoning, complex social organization, and technological capabilities we are still trying to fully understand. Some of these earthworks were actually part of vast road networks. The Great Hopewell Road stretched for nearly 60 miles, connecting the massive geometric enclosures of Newark to the ceremonial center of Chillicothe. Nearly 60 miles of elevated earthen highway, built with precise widths and alignments, complete with what appear to be rest areas and ceremonial sites along the route. That is infrastructure. That is civil engineering. And it was happening while Rome was still building its empire. Head west into the deserts of the Southwest, and you will find something equally impressive, but entirely different. Hydraulic engineering. The Hohokam people of what is now Arizona took on a challenge that would have baffled most ancient civilizations. How to farm in a desert. Not a temperate region with occasional droughts, but a true desert. Places where rainfall is measured in inches per year, not feet. Where summer temperatures routinely exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Their solution was to move the rivers. Between roughly 300 and 1450 AD, the Hohokam built over 500 miles of irrigation canals just in the Phoenix Basin alone. Not little ditches, major navigable waterways, some over 10 feet deep and 30 feet wide, capable of moving massive volumes of water from the Salt and Gila rivers to agricultural fields scattered across the desert floor. These weren't just straight lines dug into the dirt. They were sophisticated hydraulic systems with headgates to control flow distribution networks, to to divide water among multiple fields, and slope calculations precise enough to move water for tens of miles without it overflowing or stagnating. Modern engineers studying the Hohokam canals discovered they were using hydraulic engineering principles that wouldn't be formalized in European textbooks for another 1,000 years. They understood water velocity, erosion control, and sustainable flow rates. Some of their canals are still visible today. A few were even reused by the modern city of Phoenix, because 19th century American engineers realized the Hohokam had already found the optimal routes. At its peak, this irrigation system supported a population of around 50,000 people just in the Phoenix Basin. Right in the middle of the desert, growing corn, beans, squash, cotton, and agave, using technologies that transformed one of the harshest environments in North America into productive farmland. But something happened. Something that erased most of the evidence of these achievements and created the illusion that Native Americans had never altered their landscape. European colonization didn't just kill people, it killed the knowledge systems that maintained these managed landscapes. Terra preta requires constant maintenance. You have to keep adding the right mix of materials, working them into the soil, understanding the biology of the nutrient cycle. When the diseases arrived and the populations collapsed, that knowledge died with the people who held it. The gardens went wild. The forest reclaimed the zones that had been managed for millennia. Within a few generations, landscapes that had been carefully shaped by human hands looked natural to European eyes. The earthworks faded differently. Some were deliberately destroyed by settlers who saw them as obstacles to farming, or who vandalized them looking for imaginary treasure. Others were simply plowed over, their sophisticated geometry reduced to scattered piles of dirt. Thousands of mounds that once covered the Ohio Valley, only a fraction remains. The rest are parking lots, farm fields, and suburbs. Evidence of indigenous engineering buried under the infrastructure of their conquerors. The irrigation systems of the Southwest collapsed when epidemics killed those who maintained them. Without constant management, the canals filled with sediment, the gates broke. The flows became unpredictable and then stopped entirely. The desert reclaimed fields that had been green for 1,000 years. And because these landscapes transformed so quickly after contact, because the European colonizers arrived after the collapse was already underway, they saw empty lands, unused lands, a wilderness waiting to be tamed by civilization. They never saw the gardens, the earthen ramparts, the irrigation systems in their full functional glory. They only saw the ruins, and they didn't even recognize them as human creations. This misconception became foundational to American identity. The idea of the frontier, of mastering the wilderness, of bringing civilization to empty lands, all of it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. The lands were not empty. They were not wild. They had been carefully managed for thousands of years. Europeans simply arrived after the managers were gone. And now, as we finally begin to recognize what was here, we realize something profound. The relationship of Native Americans to the land wasn't about leaving nature untouched. It was about shaping nature intelligently, creating ecosystems that were more productive, more diverse, and more resilient than what existed before. They weren't conservationists in the modern sense. They were ecological engineers, and they were remarkably good at it. The question isn't whether Native Americans transformed their landscape. They absolutely did. The question is why it took us so long to stop refusing to see it. Here is what we know. When Europeans began arriving in large numbers in the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found what they described as an empty wilderness. Vast forests with no sign of human management. Prairies stretching as far as the eye could see, with only scattered bands of nomadic populations. River valleys capable of supporting cities, but containing only small villages. And from this they drew a conclusion that would shape 5 centuries of history. The Americas had always been sparsely populated, a virgin wilderness just waiting to be claimed and civilized. But here is the problem. They were looking at a graveyard. They just didn't know it yet. The debate over pre-Columbian population numbers has raged for decades. Conservative estimates from the mid-20th century put the total population of the Americas at perhaps 8 to 10 million people in 1492. That is roughly the population of modern-day New York City, spread across 2 entire continents. These numbers seem to confirm what European settlers had always claimed. The Americas were mostly empty, sparsely populated, underdeveloped. Then archaeologists started really looking. They found urban sites, agricultural terraces, fish weirs, shell middens, stretching for miles, terraced hillsides, irrigation canals, the accumulation of physical evidence of dense permanent settlements. And the numbers started to change. In the 1960s, some researchers suggested 40 million. In the 1980s, estimates reached 60 million. Today, some scholars push the number even higher, 80 million, perhaps 100 million people living in the Americas at the moment Columbus landed. That would have made the Western Hemisphere just as populous as Europe at the exact same time. This supposedly empty wilderness was in fact one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. But if that is true, where did they all go? The answer is a catastrophe so overwhelming, so complete, that it fundamentally warped the Europeans' understanding of what they were actually observing. Because by the time most Europeans arrived to document indigenous societies, they weren't observing intact civilizations. They were observing the survivors of an apocalypse. Look at it this way. It's 1492. A few ships arrive in the Caribbean. The crews interact with the local populations. They share food, trade goods, exchange breath while conversing. And in that exchange, they transmit something far more devastating than any weapon: diseases. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Diseases that had been endemic in European and Asian populations for thousands of years, giving those populations a certain degree of immunity through natural selection. But the Americas had been isolated from these pathogens for 15,000 years, ever since their ancestors crossed over from Asia. The immune systems of Native Americans had never encountered these viruses. They had no genetic defense, no acquired immunity, no cultural knowledge of how to treat these particular illnesses. What happened next wasn't just an epidemic. It was a biological apocalypse that rolled in waves across 2 continents. Here is what makes this catastrophe almost impossible to comprehend. The diseases moved faster than the Europeans themselves. A Spanish expedition would land on a coast, make contact with the local populations and leave. Weeks later, the people they had met began to fall ill. The disease would spread from village to village along trade routes carried by people who didn't even know they were contagious. By the time the next European expedition arrived in the area, perhaps years later, entire populations had already been decimated. The archaeological evidence corroborates this timeline. Excavations of village sites in the Mississippi Valley show thriving communities throughout the 15th and early 16th centuries. Then suddenly, mass graves appear. Villages are abandoned. Sophisticated chiefdoms that had existed for centuries simply vanish from the record. And all of this happened before a single European ever set foot inside the interior of North America. When Hernando de Soto marched through the southeast in the 1540s, he encountered powerful chiefdoms with large populations, fortified cities, and vast agricultural systems. When French explorers traveled through the same regions 150 years later, those chiefdoms were gone. They found scattered remnant populations living in much simpler settlements. No memory of the great cities that stood just a few generations earlier. The death toll was horrific. Modern epidemiologists estimate that virgin soil epidemics, these diseases, striking populations with no prior exposure, can kill 90 to 95% of the affected populations. That isn't a 90 to 95% mortality rate among the sick. That is 90 to 95% of the entire population. 9 out of 10 people dead in a generation or two. Try to imagine that scale of loss. Not an individual tragedy, not even a community tragedy, but an entire civilization brushing against extinction. Villages where everyone over the age of 5 died, leaving only young children unable to remember life before. Cities where the only survivors were those who happened to be away when the sickness struck. Entire languages vanishing because every native speaker died before they could teach the next generation. The cultural loss was incalculable. Specialized knowledge accumulated over thousands of years disappeared overnight. Master artisans died without passing on their techniques. Historians who held the oral records died before they could train successors. The priests who maintained the astronomical observations, the agricultural experts who knew which crops to plant and when, the healers who understood which plants cured without which words. All gone in the space of a few months or years, and the land itself changed. This is what the Europeans failed to understand when they described the Americas as a pristine wilderness. What they were seeing wasn't natural. It was the result of a catastrophic depopulation. You remember those managed forests we talked about earlier? When 90% of the people tending them died, the management stopped. The controlled burns ceased. The hunting pressure plummeted. In a few decades, forests that had been deliberately kept open and park-like became dense and tangled. Europeans saw this thick brush and assumed it had always been that way. They were actually looking at abandoned gardens reverting to the wild. Agricultural landscapes disappeared even faster. Without anyone to maintain the terraces, they eroded. Without anyone to clear the irrigation canals, they filled with silt. Without anyone to tend the fisheries, they fell into ruin. In a generation or two, landscapes that had supported hundreds of thousands of people reverted to a state that looked like wilderness to European eyes. That is where the myth of the empty continent comes from. Not from reality, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of what Europeans were actually observing. They arrived expecting to find either civilization as they understood it, meaning cities, states, and written records, or they expected to find savages, primitive peoples living in harmony with nature. When they found neither, when they found remnant populations living in seemingly simple conditions within seemingly unmodified landscapes, they assumed that was the natural state of things. But we have proof of what it actually looked like before. The earliest explorers, the very first European contacts, described something completely different. When Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed up the Atlantic coast in 1524, he described the landscape near what is now North Carolina as being so charming and pleasant that he thought he was in some kind of Arcadia or paradise. He saw cultivated fields stretching for miles, open park-like forests and populations dense enough that they could see the smoke from countless fires rising along the coast. When French explorers first reached the Great Lakes in the early 1600s, they described rivers so thick with fish you could almost walk across their backs. They described flocks of passenger pigeons so vast they darkened the sky for hours. They described forests full of deer, elk, and bear in such numbers it seemed impossible. This wasn't a pristine wilderness. It was a carefully managed landscape at the peak of its productivity, managed for populations far larger than what Europeans would encounter just a few decades later. By the time the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, the catastrophe was already well underway. The site they chose for their settlement, the cleared fields they found ready for planting, hadn't been abandoned out of convenience for them. It was the site of Patuxet, a Wampanoag village that had been completely wiped out by disease just a few years earlier. They were literally building on graves, settling on a land that had been emptied by an apocalypse they didn't understand and hadn't witnessed. The weight of this catastrophe, the absolute emotional and cultural devastation, is rarely captured in history books. We talk about percentages and population estimates, but we rarely take the time to process what that means in human terms. The trauma of watching everyone you know die, the survivor's guilt. The impossibility of maintaining your culture when there is no one left to teach it to. The heartbreak of watching landscapes your people shaped for thousands of years turn wild and alien because there aren't enough survivors to care for them. Imagine trying to preserve your identity, your language, your traditions, when 90% of your people are gone. When the elders who held the knowledge are dead. When there aren't enough young people to learn all the skills that need to be passed down. You have to triage your own culture. Decide what can be saved and what must be let go. Because there simply aren't enough survivors to preserve everything. And this happened everywhere. From the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Wave after wave of disease struck indigenous populations. The timing varied by region. The death toll varied based on population density and isolation. But the pattern was the same. Initial contact followed by catastrophic die-off, then societal collapse, and finally the arrival of Europeans into an already emptied landscape. The Americas that Europeans colonized were not the Americas that existed before contact. They were the echo of something much more complex, much more populous, much more sophisticated. And because Europeans never saw what had been, because they only saw the aftermath, they built their understanding of indigenous peoples on the foundation of a profound mistake. They assumed they were observing the natural state of Native American societies, when in reality, they were observing those societies right in the middle of the worst catastrophe in human history. The empty wilderness wasn't real. It never was. It was a myth born from the timing of arrival, from showing up just after the apocalypse, and assuming that what you saw was what had always been. But something survived. Some of the knowledge was preserved. Certain communities held on, even as the world they knew was ending. And what they built next, what they created in the shadow of the catastrophe, tells us everything about resilience, about adaptation, about the human capacity to rebuild, even when all seems lost. Picture this. It's 1754, and Benjamin Franklin is sitting in Albany, New York, trying to convince the British colonies to unite against the French. He has a plan, something he calls the Albany Plan of Union. But the thing is, it's not really his plan. Not entirely. He is borrowing heavily, almost directly, from a political system that had already been operating successfully for over 300 years, right under his nose. A system run by a people his society didn't even consider civilized. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, 5 nations, later 6, bound together by a constitution so sophisticated it would make most European monarchies of the time look like feudal chaos. The Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca had figured out something Europeans were still dying over in wars. How do you maintain independent sovereignty while creating a unified government for shared interests? How do you balance individual liberty with collective security? How do you keep the peace among peoples who had every reason to be enemies? They called it the Great Law of Peace, the Guyana-Shagoa. And it wasn't a vague collection of traditions, it was a detailed constitutional framework, with checks and balances, a separation of powers, and democratic processes that would have seemed almost impossible to most of the world in the 15th century when it was created. Here is how it worked. Each nation kept absolute control over its internal affairs. No central authority could dictate to the Mohawk how to run their villages, or to the Seneca how to manage their resources. But for matters affecting the whole Confederacy, war trade agreements, diplomatic relations with other peoples, they gathered in a grand council. 50 peace chiefs or sachems represented the 5 nations, and interestingly not proportionally. The Onondaga had 14 sachems, the Cayuga 10, the Mohawk and Oneida 9 each, the Seneca 8. It wasn't based on population, it was designed to ensure that no single nation could dominate the others. Decisions required consensus, not a simple majority. Every sachem had to agree before the Confederacy took action. If consensus wasn't reached, the matter was set aside, sent back to the individual nations for further discussion. Think about what that implies. In an era when European kings could declare war on a whim, when divine right meant absolute power, the Haudenosaunee had created a system where no decision affecting the whole people could be made without deep debate and universal agreement, where power was distributed so evenly that tyranny became structurally impossible. But here is where it gets truly remarkable. These sachems, these leaders with the power to commit their nation to war or peace, they weren't chosen by warriors or councils of men. They were chosen by women, specifically by the clan mothers, the eldest women of each clan, who held the power to nominate leaders and, crucially, to remove them if they failed in their duties. This wasn't symbolic. The clan mothers held real political power. They could veto declarations of war. They controlled the food supplies, which gave them economic leverage over military campaigns. They had the final say on matters involving children, land use, and resource distribution. In many ways, they held more practical power than the sachems themselves. European observers didn't know what to make of it. Their entire political philosophy rested on patriarchy, on the idea that political power naturally flowed from male military might. The concept of women holding a veto over war, of female leaders choosing male representatives, was beyond their comprehension. So most of the time they ignored it, pretended not to see it, or dismissed it as savage customs unworthy of serious political consideration. But the Founding Fathers knew. Benjamin Franklin had extensive contact with Haudenosaunee leaders. He attended treaty negotiations. He watched their council meetings. Thomas Jefferson hosted Iroquois delegates at Monticello. John Adams studied reports on their governmental systems. They were fascinated by a working democracy in a world dominated by monarchy. The Albany Plan of Union, proposed by Franklin in 1754, bears a striking resemblance to the Haudenosaunee structure. Independent colonies retaining sovereignty over their internal affairs, but united under a common council for mutual interests. The idea of a confederation of unity without centralization wasn't invented in Philadelphia. It was borrowed, adapted, sometimes acknowledged, but more often quietly appropriated from peoples who had been practicing sophisticated democratic governance for centuries. And the Haudenosaunee weren't unique. Across North America, indigenous peoples had developed political systems of stunning sophistication and remarkable diversity. The Muskogee Creek Confederacy in the southeast functioned as a complex alliance of towns, each maintaining independence while cooperating on regional matters. They developed what anthropologists call a dual governance system. Red towns focused on military matters, with war chiefs and warriors making decisions about defense and conflict. White towns focused on peace diplomacy and civil affairs. Power shifted between the red and white leadership depending on the circumstances, creating a built-in system of checks and balances. In the Pacific Northwest, the Tlingit Haida and other coastal peoples organized into complex house systems. Each house was an economic and political unit, led by leaders whose authority came from their ability to manage resources and maintain the house's prestige through complex gift-giving ceremonies called potlatches. Power wasn't inherited automatically. It had to be earned and kept through displays of generosity and wisdom. The Osage in the Great Plains developed a moiety system, dividing their entire society in half the Sky People and the Earth People. Each moiety had specific responsibilities. The Sky People handled war and hunting. The Earth People managed agriculture and peace. You had to marry someone from the opposite moiety, creating kinship ties that bound every person to both halves of the society. Political decisions required cooperation between the two halves, ensuring no faction could ever dominate. What is striking about all these systems is how different they were from European political models of the same era. Europeans organized politically around hierarchy, power flowing down from kings to nobles to commoners. Authority came from above, enforced by violence or the threat of violence. Native American systems, conversely, tended to organize around consensus and persuasion. Leaders led by example and eloquence, not by coercion. A Cherokee chief who couldn't convince his people to follow him simply wasn't a chief anymore. Power flowed upward from the people. It didn't trickle down from an authority. This created political cultures that European observers often found baffling. Colonial archives are full of frustrated governors complaining that indigenous leaders couldn't control their people, couldn't force compliance with treaties. What they were actually observing was the fundamental difference between authoritarian governance and consensus-based governance. Indigenous leaders didn't have the power to force anyone to do anything. They had to persuade, negotiate, find agreements. And it worked remarkably well in many cases precisely because it was decentralized. When decisions required broad consensus, you got community buy-in. People followed through on the action because they had participated in the decision-making process. Contrast that with European systems where kings could commit nations to wars their people opposed, where subjects had no voice in the decisions that shaped their lives. The diplomatic networks that indigenous peoples created across North America demonstrate just how sophisticated their political systems were. Trade routes stretched for thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. These weren't just economic networks, they were political relationships, carefully tended alliances that required constant diplomacy, negotiation, and gift exchange. The ancestral Puebloans created a trade network that moved seashells from the Pacific coast to communities in New Mexico, and turquoise from Southwest mines to peoples in Mexico and beyond. Every exchange was a political act, a renewal of relations, a reaffirmation of alliances. These networks required standardized protocols, agreed-upon rules of conduct, methods for conflict resolution. In other words, international law. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated systems of international relations centuries before European concepts of international law emerged. But here is what really matters about all this political sophistication. It was systematically ignored, dismissed, or actively suppressed by European colonizers and their descendants. The Founding Fathers could borrow ideas from indigenous governance, while simultaneously denying that indigenous peoples were capable of civilization. Anthropologists could document complex political systems while classifying the people who created them as primitive. This wasn't accidental. Acknowledging the political genius of Native American governance would have undermined the entire justification for colonization. If these peoples had sophisticated democracies while Europe was ruled by monarchies, if their women held political power while European women couldn't vote, if their consensus-based systems created stable societies, while Europe tore itself apart in religious wars, by what right could Europeans claim superiority? What justification existed for taking their land? So the political achievements were buried, dismissed as savage customs, rewritten as primitive tribalism. The very democratic principles that influenced the Constitution were scrubbed from the historical record when applied to their indigenous origins. Clan mothers who held real political power became invisible in colonial accounts. Sophisticated diplomatic networks became mere trade routes. Consensus governance that prevented tyranny became proof of weak leadership and political chaos. We are still living with the consequences of that erasure. Civics classes still teach that the origins of democracy lie in ancient Greece and Enlightenment Europe, completely ignoring the functioning democracies that existed in North America for centuries before European contact. But the evidence is there in the historical record, in the oral traditions that survived in the very structure of the American government that borrowed so heavily from indigenous models. The political genius wasn't forgotten because it never existed. It was forgotten because remembering it would require acknowledging a truth too uncomfortable for the colonial narrative. That genius is still there, still visible to anyone willing to look past the myths and see what indigenous peoples actually created. Political systems built on consensus rather than coercion, on persuasion rather than violence, on balance rather than domination. Systems that in many ways were more democratic, more egalitarian, and more successful than what replaced them. Imagine lying on your back in a field 1,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now the American Midwest. No streetlights, no airplanes, just a sky so dark and clear, the Milky Way looks like a river of crushed ice. Above you, the stars rise and set with perfect regularity. For most people, it's just beautiful. For your ancestors, it was data. They weren't guessing. They weren't just randomly noticing that stars are sometimes out. They tracked them, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. At Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, they built a circle of red cedar posts aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. Archaeologists call it Woodhenge. It wasn't a random circle. When the sun rose at just the right point on the horizon, the alignment marked the change of seasons, the time to plant, the time to harvest, the time to hold ceremonies. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved spiral petroglyphs where a shaft of sunlight would pierce or bracket the spiral on the solstice. A stone clock driven by the tilt of the earth. Further south in Mesoamerica, the Maya developed calendar systems of stunning precision. They didn't just count days, they tracked cycles. The 260-day ritual calendar, the 365-day solar year, the long count capable of measuring centuries. They recorded eclipses, predicted planetary movements, and built observatories where windows and angles aligned with the rise of Venus or the appearance of the Pleiades at dawn. For them, astronomy wasn't a separate science. It was the framework that bound agriculture, religion, politics, and time itself into a single coherent system. And this pattern didn't stop at the famous cities of the Americas. From the Arctic to the Amazon, people studied the sky with as much care as any modern astronomer, but with different tools. No telescopes, no computers, just patient observation and memory, wrapped in stories and ceremonies so it would never be forgotten. That same meticulous attention is found in medicine. You've probably heard the stereotype that indigenous medicine was just superstition, while real medicine began in Europe. The facts suggest otherwise. Many of the drugs modern pharmacology relies on were first learned from indigenous healers, then stripped of their origins. Willow bark used by indigenous peoples for pain and fever contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. The bark of certain South American trees provided the compound that became quinine, one of the first effective treatments for malaria. Arrow poisons used by indigenous hunters in the Amazon eventually led to the development of modern muscle relaxants used in surgery. Even tobacco started as a powerful medicinal and ritual plant used in controlled, meaningful contexts centuries before it was turned into a mass-market consumer product. None of this was random trial and error. You don't test hundreds of plants safely by accident. You do it methodically with observation, with memory. Healers watched which plants animals chewed when they were injured. How different preparations, raw, boiled, dried, smoked, altered the effects. They learned which combinations were dangerous, which were curative, which required ritual framing, because medicine was as much social and spiritual as it was biochemical. Among the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, the Navajo, the Maya, the Quechua, the Mapuche, and many others, medical knowledge was maintained as a specialist discipline. Apprenticeships could last years. Knowledge was passed on carefully, often only to those who had already proven they could handle the responsibilities. When European doctors later collected this information, they wrote it down in Latin and English filed it in textbooks, and the original sources faded into footnotes or vanished entirely. Behind the medicine and the astronomy was something modern people don't always recognize: mathematics. You might not see chalkboards or equations, but counting systems were everywhere. The Inca developed a base 10 system with positional values organized through quipus, bundles of knotted cords. Different types of knots and their positions represented numbers. Colors and groupings added layers of meaning. To an untrained eye, it looked like string. To a specialist, it was ledgers, census data, tax records, perhaps even narratives encoded in numerical sequences. The Maya used a vigesimal or base 20 system featuring the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in many parts of Europe. They recorded massive calendar intervals, performed complex calculations, and created tables capable of predicting eclipses over long periods of time. Counting wasn't just for trade. It was for tracking cycles, managing tribes, organizing labor, and linking events to precise dates. Even in smaller-scale societies without monumental architecture, mathematical thinking was woven into daily life. Systems for counting shells, hides, or baskets used consistent units. The distribution of food and goods at feasts followed structured patterns. Oral rules encoded ratios and fair shares. You don't see numbers on a page, but you see arithmetic at work. Proportional division sequences, equivalence obligations, tallied and remembered. And all of this, the stars, the medicines, the numbers, had to be stored somewhere. In a world without widespread writing, the indigenous peoples of the Americas built memory palaces out of sound rather than stone. Oral traditions weren't just entertaining stories, they were living archives. Among the Haida or the Tlingit on the northwest coast lineage histories, fishing rights and territorial boundaries were wrapped in epic narratives and song cycles. Among the Dene, complex ceremonial chants, preserved diagnostic systems, treatment sequences, cosmological maps, and ethical guidelines. In the Andes, myths traced routes through the mountains and valleys, indicating where to find water, where the frosts came early, or where landslides had once destroyed villages. To an outsider, a story about a trickster or a culture hero might sound like a myth. To an initiate, it was also a set of instructions. When to burn the prairie, when to leave a hunting ground, when the salmon run would arrive, what to do if the snow was late or the river ran dry. The details were fixed. Elders corrected young reciters if they missed a line, reversed an order, or misnamed a plant. Accuracy wasn't a bonus, it was a matter of survival. This precision extended to ecological knowledge. Long before phrases like sustainability or ecosystem management were coined, indigenous societies were already running long-term experiments on how to live with a landscape without destroying it. On the Pacific coast, selective burning created rich habitat mosaics favoring berries, game, and specific useful plants. In the southeast, controlled fires kept forests open, reduced catastrophic wildfires, and maintained ideal conditions for both farming and hunting. In the Amazon, the so-called pristine jungle hides anthropogenic forests, groves of Brazil nut cacao and fruit trees carefully tended over generations, and tracts of dark, fertile terra preta created by intentionally adding charcoal, bone, and organic waste. In the Great Plains, buffalo hunting wasn't random slaughter. It was guided by knowledge of herd behavior, grass growth, and migration patterns. Overhunting an area risked starvation. Later communities developed norms and taboos to prevent it, weaving ecological limits inside spiritual narratives. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters read subtle variations in snow ice, wind, and animal tracks. a multivariable calculus performed with the eyes, ears, and skin. These were scientific systems, not science in the sense of white lab coats, but the science of systematic observation, hypothesis testing, refinement, and long-term feedback. The instruments were the seasons, the stories, and the agreements about what worked and what had once gone terribly wrong. And yet so much of this intellectual heritage did not survive contact. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and later government officials rarely recognized indigenous knowledge systems as actual knowledge. Astronomical alignments were dismissed as coincidences. Medicines were appropriated without acknowledging the source. Counting systems were rebranded as primitive. Oral traditions were treated as interesting legends perhaps, but unreliable. Then came the deliberate erasure. Boarding schools and missionary schools punished children for speaking their own languages, the very languages that carried the technical vocabularies of plant use, rituals, astronomy, and laws. Elders who once passed down specialized knowledge found themselves without apprentices or with grandchildren too afraid to be caught learning the old ways. Sacred sites aligned with solstices were built over quarried or flooded by dams. Healers were prosecuted as sorcerers. Keepers of ceremonial songs had their roles outlawed or were forced underground. Libraries of knowledge that had been maintained in human memory for centuries unraveled in a few generations. Some of it survived anyway, hidden in families, whispered in kitchens, practiced in isolated valleys. Some of it has been painstakingly reconstructed by indigenous scholars working with elders, archaeologists, linguists, and botanists. But much of it is gone. Entire pharmacopoeias, ecological models, astronomical records, and philosophical systems that we can never fully recover. When we say Native Americans are not what we thought they were, this is partly what we mean. They weren't simply people living close to nature in some vague, romantic sense. They were scientists of space and time, mathematicians of memory, doctors through plants and stories, astronomers of a light, unpolluted sky. And when that knowledge was attacked, the loss wasn't just theirs. It was a loss for humanity as a whole. The next part of this story pulls us into a darker chapter, where the assault on indigenous minds and cultures becomes organized, systematic, and relentless. An attempt not just to control the land, but to rewrite memory itself. By the time Europeans arrived in the Americas, indigenous societies had already spent thousands of years practicing something rarely featured in textbooks: power politics. They weren't wandering aimlessly in untouched nature. They managed states, coalitions, war leagues, and diplomatic networks. When the first Spanish, French, Dutch, and English ships appeared on the horizon, indigenous leaders didn't freeze like deer in the headlights. They did what their ancestors had always done when a new power entered the neighborhood. They studied them, tested them, negotiated with them, used them. The stereotype you were probably taught is simple: indigenous people as passive victims crushed by the superiority of European weapons technology and organization. A tragic but inevitable collapse. Curtain falls. But the archives tell a completely different story. For centuries after first contact, it was the Europeans who were scrambling to keep up. Time and time again, colonial powers found themselves outmaneuvered by indigenous strategies they barely understood. Imagine you are a European commander trained in the rigid warfare of 17th century Europe. Lines of musketeers, drums and flags, forts laid out in clean geometric shapes. You arrive in North America expecting to play the same game with different players. Instead, you discover a continent where warfare is something else entirely. Indigenous armies fought in flexible, decentralized units. They used the land as armor. Forests, swamps, river bends, canyons. They moved silently over distances European soldiers deemed impossible, guided by generations of knowledge about trails, weather, and animal movements. Lightning strikes, night raids, decoys, feigned retreats that drew enemies into carefully prepared ambushes. Operations planned not for days, but sometimes for seasons, depending on when the rivers froze, when certain plants bloomed, when the game migrated. European officers described in their journals invisible enemies, units that vanished into the trees and reappeared miles away. Supply lines that seemed secure suddenly catching fire. Scouts disappearing without a sound. Entire expeditions lost in terrain that indigenous scouts crossed in a single day. This wasn't magic, It was systems, training, communication, and command systems honed over generations of intertribal warfare, ritual conflict, and shifting alliances. Certain indigenous societies made this their specialty. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois, built a war machine that terrified both rival indigenous nations and European colonies. Strike forces could hit deep into enemy territory, coordinated by councils of sachems who weighed intelligence, omens, and political consequences. In the southeast, the Creeks, Chickasaws, Choctaws, and later the Seminoles used similar strategies, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes the British, the Spanish, or the Americans, sometimes fighting alongside them, but always fighting at the deepest level to maintain the space necessary for their survival. And in the Great Plains, once horses spread north from Spanish settlements, equestrian warfare evolved into something the European imagination had never truly seen. Horseborne warriors from nations like the Lakota, the Comanche, and the Cheyenne could move with a speed and precision that rendered fixed forts and slow infantry columns practically obsolete. Cavalry officers who had studied Napoleon suddenly saw their tactics age by centuries in a single campaign. Yet warfare was only part of the equation. The other part, often more important, was diplomacy. When European empires looked at indigenous nations, they saw potential subjects. When indigenous leaders looked back, they saw potential allies, tools, and sometimes temporary shields against other threats. They understood something many settlers missed. Europe's power in the Americas was fractured. Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, and later the United States. None of them were unified. They weren't all powerful forces sweeping across the land. They were rival actors in a crowded political landscape, and indigenous leaders learned to play them against each other with astonishing skill. Picture the early 1700s. French traders weaving alliances along the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi. British colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast. In between, indigenous political entities holding the true balance of power. Haudenosaunee diplomats traveled to Montreal and Albany, listening carefully to both sides, securing gifts, guarantees, and favorable trade terms. They promised support, but never absolutely. They negotiated from a position of strength, not desperation. Their confederacy had already been mediating conflicts, signing treaties, and maintaining complex balances of power among its member nations for centuries. Further south, the Creek Confederacy learned to leverage Spanish Florida, French Louisiana, and British Carolina against one another. One European power would promise weapons, another offered missionaries, yet another conceded territory to maintain peace along a crucial border. Creek leaders turned this competition into breathing room supplies, and sometimes a recognition of borders that existed on no European map. Out west, the Comanches created what some historians call an empire without ever using the word themselves. Through a mix of warfare, trade, and political marriage, they built a region where Spanish and later Mexican authorities had to treat them not as a scattered tribe, but as a sovereign power whose consent was required for any major movement. These were not accidents. They were strategies born of clear-eyed calculation. And when open resistance became necessary, the leadership behind it was often as sophisticated as anything in Europe or Asia. Think of Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader in the early 1800s. He attempted something incredibly ambitious. He tried to form a pan-Indian alliance across tribal linguistic and cultural divides to resist the expansion of the United States. Not just a loose coalition of war parties, but a continent-wide political project. He traveled from the Great Lakes to the southeast, delivering speeches whose power and clarity were remembered decades later. His message was radical. The land does not belong to individual tribes to be sold off in pieces. It belongs to the nations collectively, a shared inheritance that cannot be signed away by a few chiefs around a treaty table. In another world with slightly different timing, his vision might have redrawn the map. But he faced an adversary whose population, industrial might, and hunger for land were growing at breakneck speed. After his death in 1813, the alliance he built began to fracture. Consider also the Lakota leader Sitting Bull, often depicted as the stubborn holdout, doomed to fail against the inevitable. But for decades his fate was anything but sealed. He navigated an increasingly narrow corridor of possibilities with extraordinary skill. He understood that armed resistance alone couldn't stop the United States, so he combined it with something else: refusal. refusal to cede his lands, refusal to move to reservations on unacceptable terms, refusal to accept a narrative where his people's future only existed on someone else's timeline. When the U.S. government declared him an outlaw, he crossed the Canadian border, appealing not just to British authorities, but to international conscience. It didn't save his people's territory in the long run, but it delayed dispossession, bought time, and preserved a core of independence that would resonate with his descendants. In the Southwest, Apache leaders like Cochise and later Geronimo practiced another style of resistance, highly mobile, decentralized, relying on an intimate geographical knowledge of the mountains, canyons, and deserts. They tied down thousands of American and Mexican troops for years, not by winning pitched battles, but by making conquest agonizingly costly. And through it all, the alliances continued. Not permanent simple alignments, but fluid situational partnerships. Some indigenous nations sided with the British against the Americans during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, gambling reasonably that a distant king might be easier to manage than a land-hungry republic. Some fought alongside the Union or the Confederacy during the American Civil War, calculating which outcome offered the best chance of survival. Others tried to remain neutral or become mediators, only to be dragged into conflicts by broken promises, encroaching settlers, or diseases that respected no treaty. The myth of inevitable defeat hides the actual duration of this resistance. Across much of North America, organized military resistance continued well past the end of the 19th century. In places like the Amazon, the interior of the Pacific Northwest, and parts of the Arctic, significant autonomy survived in one form or another into the 20th century. And even where the guns fell silent, the struggle didn't end. It just changed shape. In courtrooms instead of canyons, at the treaty table instead of ambushes on the rivers, through petitions, legal challenges, newspaper articles, and later international forums. Leaders like Standing Bear of the Ponca, who argued in a U.S. courtroom in 1879 that an indigenous person was legally a person. It seems absurd today that this needed to be argued, but his quiet insistence forced a judge to acknowledge something the law had refused to say out loud. Or those Haudenosaunee diplomats who, in the 20th century, traveled on their own passports, asserting a sovereignty that predated both Canada and the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, resistance took on yet new forms. Occupations of sites like Alcatraz Island and Wounded Knee, legal battles for fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest, movements that used cameras and television instead of spears and muskets, but aimed at the same target. Survival with dignity. Today, the resistance continues in ways that might seem quiet on the surface, but are no less profound. Language revitalization programs, battles over pipelines and water rights, legal campaigns to enforce treaty obligations signed generations ago, efforts to reclaim sacred sites and protect them from mining, logging, or tourism. Wars now fought in environmental hearings, university curricula, and digital spaces. When you step back, a pattern emerges. For centuries, Native Americans weren't just pushed aside by an unstoppable tide of history. They responded time and time again with creativity, courage, and strategic intelligence. On the battlefields, in the council houses, and later in the courtrooms and classrooms, they faced empires and nation-states that often assumed their victory was already written. But history isn't written in advance. It is negotiated, contested, reinterpreted. And while many indigenous nations lost land, lives, and autonomy on a staggering scale, they did not disappear. They adapted. They are still here, still fighting in different ways for the same fundamental things their ancestors defended with bows, muskets, treaties, and open-air speeches. Land, language, community, and the right to decide their own future. Understanding this means letting go of the image of indigenous peoples as shadows fading into the past and beginning to see them instead for what they have always been. Agents, strategists, warriors, diplomats, and above all, survivors. The story of cultural destruction doesn't begin with barbed wire and guard towers. It begins in classrooms. Picture this. It's the late 1800s. The military campaigns are drawing to a close. The cavalry charges the burning villages, the massacres. All of that is becoming less common. But the goal of American and Canadian policies hasn't changed. The goal is still control. The tactics just moved indoors. A new idea takes hold among policymakers, missionaries, and reformers who called themselves the Friends of the Indian. If they couldn't physically erase the indigenous nations, they would erase them culturally. Not by killing the people, but by killing the people inside them. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. That phrase was spoken by Richard Henry Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was the mission statement. The method was simple and ruthless. Take indigenous children as young as 4 or 5 years old. Remove them from their families, often by force or under the threat of withholding rations. Transport them hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. Give them new names, new clothes, new haircuts. Forbid their languages, outlaw their ceremonies, and punish any attempt to hold on to what their grandparents had taught them. On paper, it was called education. In practice, it was a massive experiment in cultural erasure. Imagine you are 6 years old. You grew up listening to your grandmother's stories in your language. You know the smell of your home, the sound of drums in the distance, the layout of the stars above the place where your people have always lived. Then one day strangers arrive. Soldiers, agents, missionaries. They tell your parents it's the law. They say it's for your own good. They tell them that if they refuse, the tribe might lose its food, its land, or even its other children. You end up in a stone building 3 days' journey away. The first thing they do when you walk through the door is take your clothes. The woven dress your aunt made, the shirt your grandfather gave you gone. They cut your hair sometimes while you cry and fight back. For many indigenous nations, hair wasn't just decoration. It carried spiritual significance, family history, social status. Watching it fall to the floor wasn't just a haircut. It was a form of mourning. Next comes the language. You open your mouth to ask a question with the only words you have ever known, and a hand comes down hard on your shoulder. Maybe it's a strap. Maybe a ruler. Maybe they put soap in your mouth. English only, they tell you, or French only. Your words, what your ancestors honed over thousands of years, the words that carried the knowledge of plants, animals, treaties, migrations, astronomy, laws, humor, prayer. Those words are suddenly dangerous. Some children adapt quickly because they have to. Others retreat into silence. A few refuse to speak for months. The teachers label them slow, backward, primitive. In reality, their worlds have been torn in half. For the governments involved, this wasn't an accidental byproduct of schooling. It was the point. Official documents spoke openly of breaking tribal ties, of civilizing indigenous children, by severing them from their savage influences. The logic was chillingly simple. If a child no longer thinks in the language of their people, if they no longer remember the stories, if they no longer know the ceremonies, then in a few generations, there will be no nation left to negotiate with, no culture to claim treaties, land, or sovereignty. This is where the trauma begins to seep from the past into the present. Because children don't just experience this and leave it behind when they graduate or escape. They carry it in their nervous systems, in their parenting, in their silence. Intergenerational trauma isn't just a metaphor, it's a repeating pattern. A child who is beaten for speaking her language might grow up and have children of her own. When her son asks why she never taught him those words, she might say she was trying to protect him, that she didn't want him to suffer like she did. And just like that, an entire language that survived the Ice Age migrations and wars ends around a kitchen table, where a mother shakes her head and says, "No, we don't speak like that anymore." That silence echoes. You can trace it through the generations. A grandparent who is in a boarding school drinks too much and never talks about his childhood. His children grow up with an unpredictable parent, learning to walk on eggshells. His grandchildren inherit the anxiety, the depression, the constant feeling of not belonging anywhere. Therapists call it complex trauma. Indigenous communities call it life. Beneath it all, the language quietly slips away. Language isn't just vocabulary. It's a way of carving reality into meaningful pieces. Many Native American languages code relationships into the grammar itself. Verbs that tell you if an action is reciprocal, if it includes the listener, if it respects the animal involved. Kinship words that distinguish not just aunt and uncle, but older from younger, maternal side from paternal, joking from serious. Terms for describing landscapes that carry within them centuries of observation on water levels, animal behavior, climate changes. When those languages are lost, it isn't just poetry that vanishes. It's ecological knowledge, legal systems, philosophies, entire ways of organizing human life. Boarding schools didn't just produce children who spoke English, they produced voids. Missing words where songs used to be. Missing ceremonies where seasonal gatherings once anchored the year, and the schools themselves were not safe. For over a century, tens of thousands of indigenous children passed through these institutions in the US and Canada. Many survived, and some even remember a few teachers who were kind. But woven through those memories are others: physical abuse, sexual abuse, forced labor, medical neglect, epidemics. Children who fell ill and never returned from the infirmary. For a long time, these accounts were treated as exaggerations or outright ignored outside of indigenous communities. Then the ground started to speak. In the 2020s, using ground-penetrating radar and archival research, investigators in Canada and the United States began locating unmarked graves at the sites of former boarding schools. Little bodies buried under schoolyards, orchards, and fields. Children whose parents had been told they ran away or got sick with no details, no grave to visit, no ceremony to perform. The numbers are still being investigated, and different sources offer varying estimates. But the pattern is undeniable. Children were taken. Many didn't come back. Their resting places were unmarked. Their names were often unrecorded. The grief carried by their families saw no official recognition for generations. Today, belatedly, the reckoning has come. Governments have issued apologies, some more sincere than others. The churches that ran many of these schools have begun internal reviews. Commissions have gathered the testimonies of survivors who describe in detail what it felt like to be a child in those institutions. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of boots in the hallway at night, the look of the sky through barred windows, the taste of the punishment meant to erase their mother tongue. The stories of survivors are not identical. Some speak of friendships forged under pressure, of secret acts of resistance, of whispering in their language under the cover, of forbidden songs hummed in storage closets, of smuggling fragments of culture through the cracks in the system. Others relive intense suffering every time they close their eyes, because the boarding school is where their innocence ended. What unites these testimonies is a quiet but fierce insistence. This didn't happen in some distant prehistoric past. It happened in living memory. Many of those telling these stories are grandparents today. Some are still middle-aged. This isn't ancient history, it's family history. And yet, even here, the story is not just about destruction. It is also a story of refusal. Because the political goal of the boarding school era was clear cultural death without physical genocide. And the languages, the ceremonies, the political identities, and leave behind only individuals who might call themselves American or Canadian, but who wouldn't say Navajo, Anishinaabe, Haida, Lakota, Muskogee, or Mohawk, with all the weight of those nations behind the words. That goal failed. It failed because grandparents who were beaten for speaking their language sometimes whispered it anyway to a favorite grandchild. It failed because elders slipped songs into religious hymns, wrapped stories in Bible verses, hid medical knowledge in gardening advice. It failed because children ran away from the schools and walked home covering vast distances following rivers, railroad tracks, and the stars. It failed because a language once learned can go dormant without completely dying. A few remembered words become a seed. When a new generation decides to learn, reclaim record, that seed can sprout again. Today across North America, there are immersion schools teaching children the very languages the boarding school system tried to eradicate. There are university courses on indigenous law, guided by elders whose grandparents were punished for practicing those same legal traditions. There are ceremonies held openly that once had to be hidden in isolated clearings or behind closed windows. The trauma hasn't vanished. It is layered in bodies, families, communities. It shows up in statistics on health, poverty, addiction, and in those quiet moments when an elder hesitates before trying to talk about their childhood, then changes the subject. But the resilience is just as real. The boarding school era was one of the most intense attempts at cultural erasure in modern history. Yet the targeted cultures are still here. Bruised, transformed, adapting. But here languages once whispered are being sung again by children on playgrounds. Ceremonies once outlawed are conducted in the open air. The assault on the culture was deliberate. Its wounds are deep. Its legacy continues. but like the survivors of the ancient bottleneck, who carried their genes through 117,000 years of near extinction, the indigenous peoples of today carry within them stories, songs, and identities that outlasted every policy designed to end them. The question today is not whether these cultures endured. They did. The question is whether the rest of society is finally ready to hear what they have to say. Picture the version of Native Americans most of us grew up with. Close your eyes and hold that image for a second. A man on a horse, maybe. Dark braids, a feather headdress, buckskin clothes, nobly staring at a polluted river, or riding in circles around a wagon train, shouting war cries and shooting arrows. This image feels familiar because you've seen it 1,000 times. In cartoons, in old westerns, on cereal boxes, on football helmets. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That silhouette you're imagining isn't a real person. It's a composite character assembled from myths, marketing, and movie scripts, a kind of cultural hologram projected over hundreds of distinct nations, thousands of years of history, and millions of individual lives. To understand who Native Americans really are, we have to gently turn down the brightness on that hologram. Look at the machinery behind it, and notice just how much of what we think we know was simply made up. Let's start with two of the most stubborn myths: the noble savage and the bloodthirsty warrior. They sound like opposites, but they are actually twins. The noble savage is the idea that indigenous peoples were pure, innocent, in perfect harmony with nature, with an almost childlike simplicity. The bloodthirsty warrior is its flip side: wild, cruel, irrationally violent, incapable of civilized life. These stereotypes go hand in hand because they do the exact same job. They make indigenous peoples less than human. They strip them of being complex, strategic, or political, reducing them to symbols. In one scene, the noble savage stands silently on a cliff edge, watching the sunset, sad but resigned to the march of progress. In the next scene, the warrior charges over that same hill, nameless and faceless, just another obstacle the hero must overcome. Real history looks nothing like that. There were warriors, of course, just as there were in Europe, Africa, and Asia. People fought for territory, for honor, for resources, and for revenge. They also negotiated treaties, made peace, adopted captives, intermarried with former enemies, and formed alliances that spanned continents. There were spiritual leaders who cared deeply about the land, who understood ecological relationships with a level of sophistication that still surprises modern scientists. And there were also opportunists, schemers, people who overhunted or made bad decisions, just like in any other human society. The noble savage fantasy erases science and statecraft. The bloodthirsty warrior fantasy erases diplomacy and law. Both erase the fact that these were complete societies with philosophers, comedians, inventors, politicians, parents, rivals, friends. So where did these images actually come from? Not from indigenous peoples, but from Hollywood. Imagine a casting call in Los Angeles in the 1940s. The script calls for Indians, not Lakota, not Dene, not Haudenosaunee, not Coastal Muskogee, just Indians, a generic category, a costume choice. Producers dig into a grab bag of random cultural elements: Plains war bonnets, Southwest jewelry, generic chanting, invented sign language, and stitch it all together to create a standard Native American. In reality, there were over 500 distinct nations just in what is now the United States, and thousands more across the Americas. Different languages, different governments, different religions, different clothing, different architecture, different ideas about war, gender, family, and property. But on screen, one model was enough. So a tribe that historically grew corn in permanent towns is suddenly seen riding everywhere on horses they didn't actually adopt until centuries after contact. A nation that never wore a feather headdress is dressed in them from head to toe. A people who built multi-story stone cities in the desert is reduced to nameless riders circling a wagon train and screaming. Directors reused the same props. Costume designers recycled the same outfits, and extras were told to repeat the same war cry over and over. In the space of a few decades, the cultural diversity of an entire continent was compressed into a handful of visual cliches. Once those images locked in on screen, they started bleeding into everything else. Children's toys, Halloween costumes, car commercials, sports team logos. Along the way, many traditions were simply invented, then retroactively projected onto indigenous peoples. Think of the solemn peace pipe ceremony you've seen in a dozen movies, always staged exactly the same way. Or the idea that every indigenous language had the same mystical-sounding word for the Great Spirit. Or that every tribe sat in a perfect circle, passed a talking stick, and made decisions unanimously. Some of these practices have distant roots in real traditions. Others are pure fiction created by non-native screenwriters who needed something that felt spiritual to a mainstream audience. Throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries, white writers penned Indian speeches that were entirely made up, but presented as authentic. Politicians quoted them, textbooks reprinted them, posters framed them. Meanwhile, real indigenous leaders were delivering actual speeches about land rights sovereignty and treaty violations. And those were ignored. In other words, the voice we were given as the native voice was often just an act of ventriloquism. A non-native hand moving indigenous lips to say what a non-native audience wanted to hear. You can still see the effects today. Every time a sports fan paints their face with war paint, puts on a fake feather headdress and runs onto a field to the sound of a synthetic tomahawk chop. Mascots turn entire peoples into props. A stylized Indian head logo on a helmet. A smiling cartoon face on a jersey, a rubber tomahawk in the gift shop. Generations grew up screaming fake war cries on Friday nights without ever learning the names of the real nations whose lands they were standing on. It's casual, it's normalized, and it trains the brain to retain a silent lesson. These people are characters, not neighbors. Costumes, not citizens. The same logic shows up in jokes and casual remarks about Indian givers, or in the idea that someone with no connection to an indigenous community can declare themselves part Cherokee based on a family myth and high cheekbones. When you view a people primarily as a mascot, it becomes easier to ignore their laws, their treaties, their lawsuits, their elders, their scientists, their artists. Easier to treat living communities as an afterthought, and their imaginary past selves as the main story. But step outside the cinematic frame for a moment, and the diversity of actual indigenous life snaps into focus. Look at a linguistic map of North America before colonization. It doesn't look like a few big blocks of color, it looks like a mosaic. Hundreds of languages, many as different from each other as English is from Japanese. Algonquian languages along parts of the Atlantic coast. Iroquoian languages in the northeast. Muskogean languages in the southeast forests. Siouan languages across parts of the plains, Athabascan languages stretching from the subarctic Canada down to the southwest desert, Uto-Aztecan languages linking the Great Basin to central Mexico, and dozens more, each with its own poetry, its own humor, its own way of talking about time, land, and kinship. Clothing ceremonies and beliefs were just as varied. Some nations built earth-covered lodges that stayed warm through brutal winters. Others built massive cedar plank longhouses on the Pacific coast, adorned with intricately carved poles telling family histories. Some erected monumental mounds aligned with the solstices and the rising of the stars. Others moved seasonally with the salmon runs or the buffalo herds, following patterns older than many European cities. Ideas about property and governance ranged from highly centralized chiefdoms to complex federations, from strict hereditary leadership to councils where everyday people could overrule a chief's decisions. There were matrilineal societies where clan identity and land rights passed through the mother's line. There were nations where certain clans specialized in diplomacy, others in ceremonies, others in war. Even the relationship to animals and landscapes wasn't the single uniform story of living in harmony with nature. It was 1,000 different specific relationships. Prairies burned to encourage the growth of certain grasses, forests thinned to favor nut trees, fisheries, irrigation ditches, and terraces, each adapted to the local ecology through centuries of observation and experimentation. So when someone says Native Americans believed X or Native Americans did Y, it's usually a sign that the Hollywood composite is talking not real people. Why does all this matter, especially in a video meant to help you fall asleep? Because the stories we silently absorb before bed in classrooms, in the movies of our childhood, become the default settings of our minds. They shape who we view as fully human, whose pain registers, whose achievements impress us, whose claims feel legitimate. Correcting these misconceptions isn't about being polite. it's a recalibration with reality. When you replace a cardboard cutout with a three-dimensional person, everything changes. Political debates look different when you remember that indigenous nations are governments, not interest groups. Environmental discussions feel different when you realize that many discoveries in conservation are just rediscoveries of land management practices indigenous communities honed over centuries. Even personal identity shifts when myths of being part Indian give way to real relationships with actual indigenous nations or an honest acknowledgement of distance. Seeing through the myths doesn't make the history smaller, it makes it bigger, richer, more surprising. Instead of a single tragic figure fading silently into the sunset, you get a continent full of living cultures that debate, adapt, create, and still speak languages that survived boarding schools, bans, and punishments. You get scientists designing climate resilience projects based on traditional ecological knowledge, lawyers arguing complex sovereignty cases, artists reimagining tradition in new forms, children learning languages once declared dead. When the Hollywood lies fall away, the real story appears, and it turns out to be far more interesting than anything shot on a movie set in 1953. The question then is simple. Once you see the myths for what they are, what else in this story is waiting to be seen in a new light? Now shift the camera in your mind, not to mammoths or ancient cities, not to ruined mounds or collapsed empires, to a traffic light turning red in front of a tribal casino, to a kid scrolling on a cracked phone in the hallways of a high school in Pine Ridge, to an indigenous scientist calibrating a microscope at 2 a.m. in a university lab, to a drum group practicing in a community center next to a basketball court. Because one of the biggest mistakes we make when we talk about Native Americans involves the tense of the verb. We talk about them in the past tense. We use words like were and used to. We talk about the tribes that lived here, as if they packed up and left the stage so the modern world could walk on. But open your eyes to the present. There are more indigenous people alive today in the Americas than at almost any other point in the last 500 years. New babies, new songs, new laws, new battles, new ideas. Not a vanished world, a living one. The problem with the past tense isn't just a grammatical error. It's a way of erasing people while they are still standing right there. Textbooks show teepees and buckskin, then quietly stop the story around 1900, as if indigenous life froze in sepia tones and never made it to color. Westerns end with the cavalry arriving, or with the last stand of a generic, doomed tribe fading to black. But outside the theater, beyond the pages, another story kept unfolding. Languages declared dead continued to be whispered to children. Outlawed ceremonies went underground, held in basements, remote clearings, hidden valleys. Elders carried words and songs like embers in the palms of their hands, waiting for the moment it would be safe to let them blaze again. That moment is now. Across the continent, something remarkable is happening. Language classes in community centers and on Zoom. Immersion schools where toddlers bicker in Mohawk, Navajo, Cherokee. Teenagers joking in Ojibwe on TikTok. Radio stations broadcasting in Lakota, Yupik, Hawaiian. Languages once punished with soap in the mouth or rulers across the knuckles in boarding schools are now printed on street signs, school banners, government documents. This isn't nostalgia, it's engineering. The revitalization is deliberate, structured, scientific. Linguists work with elders to record every sound, every idiom. Young adults train to become teachers, creating children's books, apps, video games. Sometimes there is only a single fluent elder left in a community, a living library of one. Entire teams gather around them with cameras and microphones, capturing everything they can before time closes that door. Then those recordings become seeds. A word spoken into a microphone today becomes a lullaby sung to a newborn a decade from now. That is what a cultural renaissance looks like, not costumes in museums. Committees, Zoom calls, curriculum design grant applications. And somewhere in the middle of all that paperwork and planning, someone laughs in a language that almost disappeared. Of course, language alone isn't culture, but it's the skeleton the stories hang on. When a language returns, the ceremonies expand, the jokes get better, the old songs suddenly make sense again. And as the culture grows, something else wakes up too. Political power. In the United States, Canada, and many Latin American countries, indigenous nations are not simply ethnic groups, they are governments. Tribal sovereignty is the quiet, stubborn fact that indigenous nations have a legal and political existence older than the states that swallowed their territory. It isn't total independence. It's a tangled web of treaties, court decisions, and hard-won rights. Some nations run their own courts, their own police forces, their own school systems, clinics, and housing programs. They negotiate water rights, energy projects, casino deals. Supreme Courts debate questions that sound simple but aren't at all. Who has jurisdiction over this land? Who can arrest whom? Who can tax what? Whose law applies when the borders on the map overlap? Each case might seem obscure, technical, filled with acronyms and footnotes, but at their core, the stakes are deeply human. Whose children are protected? Which rivers are poisoned or preserved? Who has the right to say no when a corporation wants to drill, mine, or dump waste? Sovereignty isn't an abstract principle. It is a shield that some tribes manage to hold on to, dented and battered, but still capable of deflecting harm. And slowly, very slowly, that legal reality is being recognized, expanded, tested. At the same time, indigenous people are pouring into every field. The past tense narrative pretends they don't exist. A Dene astronomer helping design the Mars mission. A Haida artist whose stylized creations are displayed in museums worldwide. A Laguna Pueblo writer winning national awards. Native lawyers arguing major cases before the Supreme Court. Indigenous lawmakers drafting bills. Indigenous astronauts looking down at their homelands from orbit, carrying beadwork or eagle feathers into space. In laboratories, indigenous geneticists and ecologists are raising questions about data ownership and ethics, asking who should control biological samples taken from native communities, and who should profit from traditional knowledge about plants and cures. In cities far from the reservations, large indigenous populations thrive in places we rarely associate with them. Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, Mexico City, Sao Paulo. They form urban Indian centers, powwow organizing committees, student unions, activist networks. Many navigate multiple identities at once, urban and tribal. Modern and traditional switching registers the way you switch languages. Some code software by day and dance in full regalia by night. Some are both punk musicians and ceremonial singers. Others are quiet, private, and don't care for any labels at all. The point is simple. Indigenous life is not a museum piece. It is messy, contradictory, funny, painful, ordinary, brilliant, just like any other human life. And woven tightly into all of this law, language, art, science is the land. Because you cannot tell the story of native nations today without talking about the ground they stand on. Literally. Across the Americas, indigenous communities are at the forefront of environmental struggles. They stand in front of pipelines and block trucks. They oppose dams, mines, oil projects. Sometimes headlines reduce this to simple protests, but beneath the slogans and banners, there is a deeper framework, the land back movement. Land back doesn't always mean kicking everyone out. Most often it means restoring indigenous control over sacred sites, forests, watersheds, places where decisions are made, thinking 7 generations ahead, not just about the next quarterly report. In some places, it's already happening. Tribal nations co-managing national parks, ancient shell middens and mounds returned to local tribes, watersheds placed under legal guardianship, where rivers are granted legal personhood, and indigenous councils guide their care. Traditional ecological knowledge, the fire regimens that prevent megafires, the fishing practices that sustain salmon runs, the agroforestry systems that keep soil alive, is now being studied by ecologists and climate scientists, trying to figure out how to live on a warming planet. What some call innovation is often just the revival of methods that work for thousands of years, interrupted only by a few centuries of violence. Listening to this, you might notice a pattern. The very societies that were dismissed as primitive turn out to have had sophisticated governance systems that influenced modern democracies. The very agricultural methods called backward turn out to be resilient to climate change. The very spiritual connections to the land dismissed as superstition look today like blueprints for sustainability. None of this means indigenous cultures are frozen relics of a better past. They aren't time capsules. They are laboratories. New ceremonies emerge. Old ones are adapted for city life. Bilingual rap tracks weave traditional drumming with digital beats. Novels blend creation myths with science fiction. A kid might learn his language through an app designed by another indigenous developer who lives 1,000 miles away, but shares the same ancestral verbs. Elders speak into microphones, their voices compressed into audio files, then carried through fiber optic cables beneath oceans and highways to reach their grandchildren on another continent. Ancient wisdom flowing over modern infrastructure. Some communities are thriving, others still suffer deeply from poverty, addiction, suicide, the long shadow of the boarding schools. Trauma doesn't vanish just because laws improve or hashtags go viral. But alongside that suffering, there is a resilience so ordinary it often goes unnoticed. Grandparents raising their grandchildren, women organizing community gardens, native language conversation tables in church basements, sobriety circles in gymnasiums, mutual aid networks built during pandemics or wildfires. Small, daily acts of survival and care. When you put it all together, the lawsuits and land trusts, the immersion schools and art exhibits, the protests on muddy riverbanks, the laughter around the kitchen table, you start to see Native America not as a vanished world, but as a web of living cultures, continuing to adapt, to invent, to carry lineages stretching back thousands of years, not frozen in time, but moving through it and shaping it. So the next time you hear someone say, Native Americans used to do this, let that sentence ring in your mind. And remember that somewhere right at this very moment, an indigenous child is falling asleep to a bedtime story told in a language that survived bans and near extinction. Somewhere, a council meeting is running late as they debate budgets and water rights. Somewhere, a dancer is sewing the final bells onto her dress. A coder is fixing bugs in a language learning app. A lawyer is drafting a brief that could change who controls a river. The story didn't end, it turned a page. And the cultures we were taught to see only in sepia photographs are still here in vivid color, walking into a future they've been preparing for much longer than most of us ever realized. And now as you lie there in the dark, perhaps with your eyes half closed, the story of America probably doesn't look quite the same anymore. No longer an empty wildland waiting to be discovered, nor a side chapter that only began in 1492, but a deep, continuous human story. Ancient layered complex. A continent mapped in memory, long before it was mapped on paper. Highway networks where we saw only trails. Cities where we imagined only villages. Carefully managed forests and rivers where we saw only pristine wilderness. When you learn that indigenous peoples engineered soils, diverted waters, bred crops that feed most of the modern world, and built political systems that influenced modern democracies, the old textbook version of American history starts to look small. Flattened, almost like looking at a mountain range in a child's drawing and then suddenly flying over the real thing. You begin to realize everything that was left out. Not just events and dates, but ways of thinking, ways of relating to the land, to the community, to time itself. And here is the slightly unsettling part. If we were this wrong about the past, what might we be missing about the present? Because these people are not lost. They are our neighbors, our colleagues. They are scientists, artists, lawyers, language teachers, tribal leaders, teenagers scrolling on their phones, just like everyone else. Over 500 distinct federally recognized nations in the United States alone, and countless more beyond its borders, each with its own history, its own debates, its own future. Looking at history with fresh eyes means understanding that Native Americans are not trapped behind museum glass, nor stuck in a specific moment in the 1800s, nor defined solely by tragedy or resistance. They are participating in every chapter of the history we are still writing today. Climate policy, constitutional law, environmental restoration, art, music and film. Questions about what it means to live well on this earth. If you want this new understanding to be more than just a pleasant late-night thought, the next step is simple and doesn't require dramatic effort. Start listening. Seek out indigenous historians, writers, podcasters, and elders who tell their own stories. Read a tribal nation's website instead of just the summary in a textbook. When you travel, learn whose lands you are standing on, how they name it, how they remember it. Notice how a single landscape can hold more than one history at a time. Every new voice you hear adds another layer to the map in your mind. Every layer makes the continent richer, more real, more human. As you drift off to sleep, you don't need to remember every date, every name, every detail. What matters is the shift in perspective, the feeling that the ground beneath the familiar narratives has opened up, revealing older roots, deeper networks, a longer memory. The feeling that American history doesn't begin on a shoreline with 3 ships, but in countless camps, gardens, plazas, and council fires stretching back millennia. If this journey through the hidden side of history kept you company tonight, you can help share it with others who were taught the same narrow version of the past. When you wake up, or if you're still awake, you can gently hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that a quiet, thoughtful story is worth sharing. You can also leave a comment if you'd like. Maybe share where you're listening from, the city, the region, or if you know it, the indigenous nation whose lands you are on. Those comments become a kind of living map, a reminder that this history isn't abstract. It is right beneath your feet. And if you'd like to hear more long, unhurried stories like this one, more deep dives into the parts of the past that rarely see the light, you can subscribe to the channel. That way, the next time you're looking for something calm and curious to help you fall asleep, these stories will be waiting for you. There is also an optional membership here on YouTube for those who want to support the channel more directly. It is never expected, and you should only do it if it feels right to you. But if you do, know that it helps fund the time, research, and care that make these episodes possible. For now, you don't have to do anything at all. You can just lie there breathing slowly, letting the noise of the day fade away. Somewhere in the dark behind your eyelids, you can visualize those ancient cities, those engineered fields, those long trade routes running like threads across the continent. You can imagine the fires burning softly in the winter lodges, the stories being told, the knowledge passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. This story isn't over. You are living in a small piece of it. Let your thoughts wander. Let the timelines blur and soften. Let the names and places fade into a gentle hum in the background. History will still be there in the morning. For now, you can rest. Good night.